Today I will use Bourdieu's theory of materialism to examine the ongoing Wet'suwet'en territory conflict. I would like to start with one aspect of historical materialism that I think is particularly relevant to our discussion. It is the concept that the institutions of the superstructure serve to legitimate the interests of the ruling class. This concept suggests that through socialization and continuous subliminal reinforcement, people are conditioned to adopt and even to cherish the values that support, uphold, and enable the ruling class. The manifestation of this principle can be seen in what Marx would call the fetishism of commodities. Take, for example, an expensive car, whose high cost far exceeds its use value. Logically, the purchase of such a vehicle is foolish, yet most people, not in spite of, but because of their expense, value and fetishize these cars. Their ownership is considered a marker of distinction and success. This subconscious association of expensive car with success promulgates the idea that exorbitant wealth and inequality is normal, natural, and even desirable. Bourdieu calls this misrecognition. That is, a fancy car is misrecognized and overvalued for arbitrary reasons. Misrecognition carries from his concept of taste and distinction, which is that the tastes of the ruling class are adopted by the masses and associated with refinement, high class, and distinction. So how do the tastes of the ruling class become the tastes of the masses? Bourdieu says that habitus is the culprit. Habitus is a broad concept that encapsulates the idea that an individual's disposition, their beliefs, attitudes, and actions are all influenced by their experience. It's the idea that people are largely, if not entirely, a product of their environment. Imagine a lake with an algal bloom. The algal bloom can be thought of as a property of the lake, just as thoughts, beliefs, and actions can be thought of as properties of individuals. The reality, however, is that the algal bloom is actually the result of environmental factors, too much fertilizer dumped into the lake's headwaters. By the same token, Bourdieu suggests that through habitus, an individual's behavior is the manifestation of their social, cultural, and economic environment. This brings us to the Wet'suwet'en conflict, which has been a tenuous situation for years, but recently has garnered significant media attention. At the epicenter of the conflict is the Coastal GasLink pipeline and the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en nation. The Coastal Pipeline is a multi-billion-dollar project that will bolster the Canadian economy by allowing us to export natural gas overseas. The project has satisfied all conditions necessary to proceed and has the approval of 20 band councils that represent the First Nations whose territory it will pass through, including the 6 band councils that represent the Wet'suwet'en nation. Yet, the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en nation claim that the project does not have approval to pass through their territory. Why is this? The fact is, in the 1997 Supreme Court Delgamukwa land claim case, it was established that much of the land in British Columbia was never ceded and remains the legal property of the traditional governments of First Nations across the province. Because of this, the traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en nation, which extends beyond the boundaries of the reserve land that is governed by the band councils, is technically governed by the hereditary chiefs of the nation. Their claim is legitimate. One reason why I selected Bourdieu's theory to examine this conflict is for his concept of fields. Fields are spaces in which groups and individuals act. Bourdieu imagined that society is a patchwork of multitudes of fields, and that every person navigates in many different ones. Bourdieu imagined 3 types of capital that people have and can use in fields. He proposed that in addition to economic capital, there is social capital, which refers to the resources one derives from their social relationships, as well as cultural capital, which encompasses a person's mannerisms, their sociolex, and their credentials. The Wet'suwet'en territory conflict is being played across many fields. Foremost, it is played in a political field. The hereditary leaders insisted and have now met and negotiated with the Canadian and British Columbian governments. The primary actors are the hereditary chiefs, Carolyn Bennett, who's the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, and Scott Fraser, who's the BC Indigenous Relations Minister. The most prominent form of capital in this field is cultural. Simply put, it is the credentials of Ms. Bennett and Mr. Fraser that allow them and qualify them to negotiate with the hereditary chiefs. Although this oversimplifies the situation, the negotiations are really a game of power, with players using their social, cultural, and economic capital as leverage to get what is best for them and their people. This conflict is also played in the field of indigenous police relations. The legitimacy of the Coastal GasLink pipeline allowed them to get an injunction against the Wet'suwet'en barricades that were blocking access to the work sites on the territory. The RCMP were mobilized and tasked with dismantling these barricades. This is what ultimately prompted the arrests that sparked this whole debate again back in January. The conflict is also played in an economic field, where people, using their right to protest, have barricaded railways and captured the attention of the nation, forcing the Government of Canada to respond. These protests are a response to the continued violation of Indigenous rights by the Canadian government. They are a cry against the persisting colonial attitudes that ignore Indigenous autonomy and right to self-governance. The unfortunate reality, however, is that most Canadians don't understand how this situation relates to Indigenous rights. Rather, through habitus, most people view the railway blockades as an attack on the Canadian economy. A prevalent belief is that these protesters are being naive and childish, and that they're too focused on their own hurt feelings, and that they are damaging our collective well-being. This is an example of symbolic violence, where the beliefs and values of the ruling class are subconsciously upheld by the masses. This belief places corporate profit above human rights. Although Bourdieu's theory is useful in contextualizing the Wet'suwet'en territory conflict, I believe it lacks the ability to lucidly describe it. His concepts of capital and fields are too broad and ambiguous. They don't help us predict outcomes, and they aren't able to synthesize a constructive solution to the conflict. However, his theory remains useful, especially with his concept of habitus and symbolic violence that allow us to better understand the polarizing nature of this conflict. My hope is that the Wet'suwet'en territory conflict will resolve peaceably in ways that respect and uphold Indigenous rights, but also allow for the continued economic development of our nation. Thanks for listening.